taking a look. So any that we want to kind of go over, like we talked in the last class about doing number 71. So like number 71, there's actually a couple ways you could have done it. One person said, you know what, when I solve that problem, I'm going to multiply both sides by 2. I'm like, why 2? And they're like, oh, getting rid of the fraction on this side. Well, this is a fraction too. So we did it both ways. Here, you just have to make sure you get a common denominator as you are solving. So that if I am looking at this one, oops, didn't mean to change the page on us. So if I am taking a look here, I just have to make sure these two, before I can add or subtract them, that they have the same denominator. But we did the same problem over here and here, and I'm going to have you check that out here, and then as you finish it, then I'll. And then I know Charlie wants to have to be very helpful. All right. So as I'm looking at that, then I want to just make sure, does it matter if I multiply by 2 to get rid of the denominator, or I multiplied by 6? Here I have no fractions. Here I still had a fraction. So when I go to subtract these, I'm going to have to make sure that this has 3 in the denominator. Is it still going to be 51 over 3? Yes. Same as this was 32 minus 51, so it doesn't matter which way you do it. You just need to make sure. Can you stop and leave your answer as an improper fraction when you're in the final? Yes, you can stop right at that point, leave it as an improper. If you decide to change it to a mixed number, you could do that. You can change it to a decimal also. You just got to be really careful that how you are solving that. I want you to notice when we did 76 in class last period, when we did that one, we were looking at it and let's see. First off, we're going to pause. The person there said, well, if I'm solving for W, I'm going to divide everything by 2 right away, so I have W by itself. Could someone else have said, nope, I'm going to subtract 2L first and get this and then divide? It doesn't matter which way you do that, right? So when you're looking at those equations, both of them should be giving us this solution as we take a look at it. Last week, I talked about the absolute value part of the equation. Key thing, anytime you have absolute value, you have to isolate that absolute value first. Once you isolate it, there's usually 2 solutions, but if it equals a negative, right? Anytime absolute value is negative, you're going to have no solution. If absolute value equals negative, it's no solution right away. You don't want to go any further when you take a look at that. Any other questions as you're looking at this page? So this will be part of today's video that I'll put up as you are looking at that. I think on this page, let's look at number 78, 79, and 85. Maybe 87, and then if there's other questions that you'd like to look at, we'll look at those too. And then I'm going to tell you exactly what's going to be on the final, what is on each day, and I'll have you write that down on the back of this packet. So if I'm looking at number 78, if I want to get rid of this fraction 5/9, Joseph, what could I multiply by this so I don't have 5/9 anymore? So if I don't want to have this fraction, I could multiply everything by what? There's a couple options.
9/5.
I could multiply by 9/5. That's totally going to eliminate my fraction. It will give me a fraction on the other side, but that's okay. So we're going to put 9/5 times C equals, you have 5/9, 9/5 times 5/9, and then we add parenthesis F minus 32. Now, I will have some people distribute this 5/9. That's kind of ugly, right? 32 times 5 divided by 9, like, oh, that's a lot of extra work. So if I do this first and eliminate this, I now am left with F minus 32. And instead of keeping it as a fraction on this side, what is 9 divided by 5? What decimal do we get? 1. We do that division, 1.8. Could I write it this way? 1.8c equals f minus 32. That's a lot easier for me, right? So I have 1.8c instead of 9/5 times c equals f minus 32. And I'm trying to find what f is equal to. So if I'm doing that, Jack, what would be my next step to solve?
You replace f in the first equation with -32.
I'm going to add 32 to both sides. Does that make sense to you? Adding 32. So I get f is equal to 1.8. Could you have kept it as 9/5? Yes. Times c plus 32. That's why if you've ever traveled anywhere out of the United States, and all the temperatures are always in Celsius except in the United States. And if you're someplace, if you take it close to multiplying by 2, the temperature in Celsius, and then you add about 32, it's going to be close in temperature. Is it going to be exact? No, because it's really 1.8. If you want to get the exact temperature, right? Isn't it exact? All right, so 79 we're going to leave. Let's go over to 85, and then if there's some other one. So as I look at 85, I have to write it 2 ways. So Chandler, the first way, everything stays the same, and I'd have what? D minus 4 is greater or equal to 1. If you were going to solve that, what do you have to do?
Solve it like normal.
Yeah, like what would you add to both sides to finish? If D minus 4 is greater or equal to 1, what would you do to solve? Add. No, I want to get D by itself. How do I get D by? Add 4 to both sides. So I'd have D is greater or equal to 5. One answer, right? Justin, on the other side, we have to write it first. The opposite is inequality and opposite the number. So we're getting rid of the absolute value. We put D minus 4, and then what? Less or equal. And now we get -1. What are we doing to solve this one? Same thing as Tanner did, right? Adding 4 to both sides. Except this time when I add 4 to -1, I'm going to get D is less or equal. -1 plus 4 gives me 3. I don't know if you remember when we did absolute value, if it goes away or goes towards it. If we were going to do a graph of this one, this would be at 3 going less, and this would be at 5 going greater. They have nothing in common. So when something is greater or equal, it goes away from each other. When it's less or equal, it goes towards. We're going to look at 87 because it's just a little more difficult than number 86, but they are similar. So if I am looking at those, Hayden, you ready to start us off? What am I going to do in 87 to get the 4p by itself?
So, 5 to both sides.
And actually I have to add it in 3 places. I need to add 5 to this inequality, I need to add 5 here, and I need to add 5 in all 3 places, right? So if it's a compound one, you have to do it in all 3 places, versus if it's like 88, you solve each one separately, okay? So here, we are now going to have, Hayden, what?
8 is less than 14. Less than equal to 20.
Let's read the 20. Okay. Wyatt, what am I doing next to solve the problem?
87, right?
87, yes, that's what we're looking at.
Add 5 to 14.
Okay, we did that.
Oh.
So do you see where we're at? You with us?
Well, I was working on the page before.
Okay, no problem. What am I going to do to get 4p? I'm trying to get the p by itself.
Would you divide it by 4?
Divide what by 4?
The 4p.
Okay. I divide that one by 4. Is that it?
Well, the p, yeah. Do we have
Okay.
to divide?
But I'm trying to solve that whole inequality.
Oh,
so if
so
I divide
you
this one by
divide-
4,
the whole thing by 4.
divide all of them by 4, right? I'm going to have you just set that on top of my computer here. And then with what, Nadine?
2 is less than p, which is less than or
Yes. And if I was gonna graph this, I don't know that we asked you to graph, but just kind of remembering, P is greater than 2 is an open circle, and it's being going like 4, 3, 4, 5. And at 5, it was less or equal to 5, so it would have been like this. Okay? Do we want to look at 88 or 89? Anyone want to look at either one of those? And I'm going to give you all the steps. So if I was looking at 91, I might have had this step next. 5x minus 6 equals 10. I might have put my next step to be 5x equals 16. And again, this would all be written on the test. And then my last one equals 16/5. So this is what, on the final, it'll look like this. And what I will ask you to do is give me the reason. And again, you're going to have a word bank. So if I had that, what I'm always looking at is what changed from the first line to the second line. So the 2x plus 3x negative 2 minus 4, it looks like if I was looking at that, what would you say we were doing?
Combining like terms.
Yeah, so if I look up here, combine like terms. It's not letting me write on the board, so I'll write it on here. So you should have had combine like terms if I'm looking at that, okay? Hayden, what's our next step that we did to get from 5x minus 6 equals 10 to 5x equals 16?
Simplify.
How did you simplify? Like, what happened to that minus 6?
You added it to 10.
Oh, so look at the properties up here. Which one do you think we're doing?
Addition.
Addition property of
Equality.
addition property of equality. Addition property of equality. I don't know why it's not letting me write on the board, and it's a little tougher on the stuff. My last step, if I'm looking at this, Dustin, would be what? What did we do to get from 5x equals 16 to x equals? So, divided both sides by 5, so that is going to be the division property of equality. Now, the simplify would have been, say, if we would have had something like 22/4, and then the next line down, so I have x equals 22/4, and then the next line I have x equals 11/2, right? That's just being simplified, okay? Combining like terms and simplifying are not the same thing, so when you combine or add your like terms, just making sure. If you add something to both sides, addition property. If you multiply on both sides, the multiplication property of equality, right? You guys should remember distributive property, right? So if I'm sorting this one out, I'm definitely using distributive property in 92, because I look at 4x minus 8 plus 7 equals 2x. That is definitely starting with the distributive property, okay? Then the next step that I probably would have given you was like the combining my like terms and saying 4x minus 1 equals 2x. And I might say something like negative 1 equals negative 2x. And then I might set an answer as x equals 1/2. So again, if I was looking at that and filling them in after distributive property, I would go with adding like terms. Adding like terms, I would then go subtraction property of equality, because we subtracted negative 4x on both sides. And the last step is division property of equality, because we divided both sides. And all those answers are in the back as you are looking at those, okay? So, day 1 of the final. So, the final is about 90 points total. As I said, we're back in school next week, all 4 days, so your final will be Monday, Tuesday, and then by Wednesday we'll be getting into lesson F3. So, please, on the very back page of your final exam, turn to very back where you got a blank space, so maybe on the very back of that answer key. There might be room, or you might turn a little more forward. So on day 1, here are the types of questions you're going to have. So day one, you need to be able to write a two-variable linear, you can see my writing wasn't great last period, linear equation. So when I am taking a look at that, the first day when I take a look at those, I need to be able to write two-variable linear equation. There's going to be 6 questions. These are the ones where I say, give me an equation, I draw a line. So you might see a line, and I'll say, give me the equation. Easiest form, point slope, right? Unless I tell you slope intercept. Easiest one, when I'm looking at a line, is point slope. I'm going to say, oh, you have to write it in standard form. Standard form, that's kind of where you have like ax plus by equals c, right? I might ask you to make sure you can write it in a slope-intercept form, right? On the second page of the final exam that day, so you start on the first page, you have 6 questions writing linear equations. You'll turn to the second page, and I'll give you 2 equations, and I'll ask you, or 2 inequalities, and I'll ask you to graph. Inequality and equality equation. So one of them you will shade, the other one will just be a line. Right? The shading is your greater or less than, greater or equal, less or equal. Then on the bottom of that page, you have to write both a recursive and an explicit form for a sequence. So I'll give you a sequence and I'll say, tell me what is the recursive or explicit, and then maybe tell me 8 weeks later, or tell me what the 8th number in the sequence is, or tell me what the 10th number or the 5th number. So you'll have to use those equations. The next 4 questions that you're going to see are going to be to interpret and compare key features of our linear, of any of our functions. Well, when it's linear, we had slope, we had y-intercept, and then I ask you, well, what does it mean in a story situation? What does the slope mean? And you might say, oh, it meant dollars per hour. Not rise over run, not y's over x's, but in a story situation, it means the starting point, and it might mean what was your rate of change, okay? Absolute value, we kind of talked about in our notes, what is a parent function? So the parent function here. And then I'm going to give you probably a absolute value function that kind of looks like point slope form, right? So if it's in point slope form, what are the key features that I'm going to ask you about this one? Well, I'm going to ask you, where's the vertex? Oh, that comes from the x1 and y1, right? I'm going to ask you about the slope, which tells us both the direction and the width. So that slope in front is going to tell me if it goes up or goes down. It's going to tell me if it's really wide or if it's really narrow. So those would be key features that I would ask for you to tell me about. Then the last 4 questions on the test is going to be kind of like test D, where you're going to be solving real world systems of equations. On that last page of the test, there are going to be 2 that you can solve any way you like. So 2 that you're just going to solve. You can use substitution or elimination, I don't care. Whichever method you kind of like as you're doing those. And then I'm going to give you a graph. So there's going to be one that you have to graph. And when I'm talking about the graph, it's probably going to be an inequality. So I'm going to be looking for you to shade. And the last one is that you have to write the equation and solve. So on test D, you know, we did one day, or the first part of the test, I gave it to you, you just wrote those equations, and then you solved it on the second half of the test. This time, I mean, obviously, we're just gonna do it, it's all in one. I'm hoping you know what you're doing and can write those equations and take a look at that. So, 15 questions, day 2. The first one that we are gonna be taking a look at is that you can solve equations and inequalities. That would be our literal equations, the ones where I say solve for m or solve for x or solve for w, right? There's going to be some absolute value ones. This is where you have to give the reason. This is where you could see infinitely many solutions or no solution. So when you think about the final review packet, those were those last ones that we were just going through, questions 66 through 94. That's these questions on the review, 66 to 94. Okay, on your review. Create an equation or inequality and solve. There's going to be 2 that you have to write and 2 that you have to write and solve. And again, these are not the super hard ones. These are the ones like when you were looking at not systems, but when we did number 61 to 65, kind of. This is 61 to 65 on the review. Okay? Representing the bivariate data. This is kind of like problem 35 and 36 on the final review. Okay? So these are all on your review. Someone said, what does it mean to represent and analyze bivariate data? So there's going to be 3 questions. First thing you are going to have to do, number 1, you have to plot the data. I will give you the variables. Like I'll put a label down here and I'll put a label here. So you're going to know that whatever number this is, so like if this is 10 and then 4, you're going to go to 10, 4. You're going to put a point, right? You're going to make a scatter plot. So that's the first part of that. The second part, you have to draw a trend line. So your trend line should be half the data above and half the data below. Could it go through some data points? It definitely could. So again, if you look in your review, 35, 36, those are those 2 questions. Next, you have to write an equation. When you write an equation, the easiest way to start is point slope form. So if I'm starting out that equation, I know a point. You're going to tell me, oh, I used this point, and then I found my slope by using 2 points. Okay, so I need to know the x, y. You're going to find the slope. That slope might be something like negative 2.75, right? You're going to write it as a decimal, and you're not going to keep it as a fraction. And then the last part, use the equation to solve it. Okay? So you'll use that equation to solve. This is pretty much the 2 days of the final, what you will be doing.